Vince Gill never thought he'd have to teach his wife how to remember a song again. But after Amy Grant's accident, the woman who once filled arenas with faith and laughter suddenly couldn't remember the words that made her famous. The voice that carried millions through heartbreak and hope had gone quiet, and in its silence, Vince found himself praying, not as a musician, not as a husband on stage, but as a man terrified he'd lose the person who made his world make sense. For decades, Amy Grant was untouchable, the queen of Christian pop, the smile that never faded. But one summer afternoon in Nashville, everything changed. A crash, a phone call, and then months of darkness that not even her strongest believers could understand. Now, as Vince Gill stands beside her once more, guitar trembling in his hands, fans can see it in his eyes. The truth he's carried ever since that day. This isn't just a comeback. It's a miracle that almost didn't happen. Before the world ever knew her as the queen of Christian pop, Amy Grant was a barefoot teenager with a borrowed guitar, singing about love, faith, and forgiveness in a Nashville church basement. Her voice wasn't polished or showy. It was something rarer. It was kind. It carried a warmth that made strangers feel known. A voice that could soften even the hardest edges of a crowded room. By the late 1970s, when she released her first album, she was barely out of high school. Yet her songs already carried the wisdom of someone twice her age. Audiences didn't just listen to Amy Grant, they believed her. Every lyric sounded like a prayer you might overhear in your own kitchen, whispered between heartbreak and hope. She never hid her humanity behind religious perfection. That honesty became her signature, and soon she was doing what few artists dared, blending faith with pop in a way that didn't divide, but united. Albums like Age to Age and Lead Me On redefined what Christian music could be, earning her Grammys and a level of mainstream acceptance that no artist in her genre had achieved before. Then came 1991, Heart in Motion. The year Amy Grant crossed over completely, smiling on MTV beside George Michael and Madonna. The hit single Baby Baby made her a household name, but even at the height of her fame, she remained grounded. Fans called her America's Angel, but behind the stage lights, she was a mother, a believer, and a woman who still prayed before every show. That humility was what first caught Vince Gill's attention. He was already a respected country musician, known for his steel-smooth voice and gentle spirit. Their paths crossed in the early 90s through the Nashville music scene. At first they were colleagues, then collaborators. When they finally fell in love years later, both divorced, both older, both softened by life, it felt less like celebrity gossip and more like fate. Vince would later say that Amy had a light in her that never went out, no matter how dark the room. And for years that light never flickered. Through the 2000s and 2010s, Amy's career slowed by choice, not by force. She focused on family, charity work, and music that mattered. When she did appear on stage, it was with grace, her voice a little lower, her presence somehow even warmer. Fans said she glowed differently now. Not like a star, but like a soul who had found peace. She toured with Vince, often closing concerts with duets that felt more like prayers than performances. But beneath all that calm, life was quietly shifting. Amy had been dealing with minor health concerns. Surgery for a heart condition in 2020, fatigue, the kind of weariness that fans never saw. She rarely spoke about it. Instead, she smiled through interviews, thanking God for each new day. That resilience made what happened next all the more devastating. Because when Amy Grant's name suddenly disappeared from concert posters in the summer of 2022, no one expected the reason would shake her entire world and nearly break the man who loved her most. It was an ordinary July afternoon in Nashville, the kind of golden summer day Amy Grant had sung about her whole life. Blue skies, steady breeze, a city humming with quiet peace. She set out on her bicycle, something she often did to clear her mind before rehearsals. What happened next would stop everything. Somewhere on a shaded road near the Harpeth Hills area, Amy hit a pothole and was thrown from her bike. She wasn't wearing a helmet. The impact was brutal. Within moments, passers-by called for help, not realizing the woman lying motionless on the ground was one of the most beloved singers in America. Paramedics rushed her to Vanderbilt University Medical Center. The news that followed, Amy Grant hospitalized after bike accident, spread across headlines faster than her family could process what had happened. At first, the reports were cautious. Minor injuries, stable condition. But behind closed doors, Vince Gill knew the truth was more serious. Amy had sustained a severe concussion. The blow to her head caused memory loss, fatigue, and confusion. Doctors told Vince that recovery could take months, maybe longer. For the first time in decades, there were no tour dates, no rehearsals, no stage lights, only silence and prayer. Vince canceled shows immediately. Friends said he barely left her side, sleeping in hospital chairs, holding her hand through the long nights when she drifted in and out of consciousness. She was the strong one, he'd later admit quietly, and I didn't know what to do when she couldn't even remember where she was. The woman who once led millions in faith could now barely recognize her own songs. Weeks passed. When she finally returned home, recovery was slow and unpredictable. Simple tasks felt foreign. Some mornings she'd wake up bright and ready to walk. Others she'd stare blankly, unsure of what day it was. Vince tried to keep her world gentle, soft light, no stress, no rush. He sang to her in the kitchen, sometimes playing her old songs in hopes that memory would find its way back through melody. And slowly, pieces did return. A lyric here, a phrase there. But what haunted him most were the moments when she said stop mid-song, eyes searching, and whisper, "I used to know this one." To the outside world, Amy's team released careful updates, that she was recovering well, that she looked forward to touring again soon. But those close to her say the road back was steep. The fatigue was relentless. The headaches, constant. There were days she couldn't read more than a few lines without feeling dizzy. For someone whose entire identity had been wrapped in music, this was more than physical pain. It was a loss of self. And for Vince Gill, a man who'd built his career on harmony, watching Amy lose her rhythm was unbearable. He played her recordings from old concerts, hoping her memories would awaken. Sometimes they did. Other times she'd simply smile faintly and close her eyes. He later told friends that the hardest moment came one quiet evening when he strummed the opening notes to When My Amy Prays. It was the song he'd written years earlier as a tribute to her faith, her calm, her grace, the way she prayed for others before herself. When he began to sing, Amy tilted her head, as if trying to remember. Then she said softly, "That's pretty. Did you write that?" Vince couldn't answer. He just nodded. And when she fell asleep that night, he sat beside her for hours, guitar silent in his lap, realizing the unthinkable, that the woman who'd taught the world how to pray no longer remembered the song written in her name. But even then, he refused to give up. Because if Amy had spent her life singing about miracles, Vince was determined to live one. The house in Nashville grew quieter after the accident. Where music once floated through every room, guitars leaning in corners, Amy humming while she brewed coffee. Now there was stillness. Days began in whispers, with Vince Gill checking on her before sunrise, making sure she was comfortable, that the morning light didn't hurt her eyes. Her laughter, once effortless, had turned into something rare, something fragile. But when it did appear, it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Vince had known pain before, loss, heartbreak, disappointment, but nothing prepared him for this kind of waiting. Watching someone heal from the inside out is its own kind of faith. Every day became a small act of devotion, making tea, reading her notes aloud, sitting beside her as she tried to string memories together. He learned the rhythm of recovery, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and tried to hide his fear when progress stalled. Amy, even in her weakness, refused to let despair take root. When she could speak clearly again, she'd smile and say, "I've still got a life to sing about." Her words were slow, sometimes slurred, but her faith was as steady as ever. She began praying out loud, even when she couldn't find the right words. Sometimes Vince would quietly join her, sometimes he just listened. He later told friends that those prayers sounded nothing like hymns. They were broken, halting, but holy, in a way only suffering can make something holy. Slowly, her doctors encouraged her to do what she'd always done, to use music as therapy. So Vince brought his guitar into the living room and started softly strumming old songs. Amy would close her eyes, trying to find the rhythm again. One afternoon, after weeks of trying, she began to hum along to "Thy Word." It wasn't perfect, her timing was off, and she missed half the lines. But when Vince heard that faint melody, he turned away so she wouldn't see his tears. For the first time in months, she was singing again. Each small breakthrough became a quiet victory, a remembered lyric, a familiar chord, a laugh that lasted a little longer. Vince never rushed her, never demanded perfection. He said once that loving Amy through recovery was like learning to listen for music before the notes are even written. Every gesture, every moment of patience was an act of faith. Still, there were hard days. The dizziness returned. Fatigue would steal her strength without warning. Some days she forgot entire conversations. Fans who hadn't seen her for a while began wondering if she'd ever return to the stage. But Vince stayed unshaken. He often told people that his wife's strength wasn't in her voice, it was in her spirit. "She's been carrying faith for all of us," he said quietly during one of his concerts. Friends noticed that Vince's own music began to change. His voice grew gentler, his lyrics more prayerful. The man who had spent decades writing about heartbreak was now writing about endurance. When he sang "When My Amy Prays" after her accident, he could barely finish. Every word sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than memory, from the ache of almost losing her. But Amy was listening. She told him later that hearing that song again, even when she couldn't remember all the words, reminded her who she was. "It was like someone handed me my own heart," she said softly. By autumn, she was strong enough to take short walks in the garden. Vince followed a few steps behind, guitar in hand, playing softly, while she moved through the sunlight. Neighbors sometimes saw them and stopped to watch. Two people who had built entire careers around music, now learning how to live quietly within it. It wasn't the stage they were used to, but it was sacred all the same. And though the world didn't yet know it, those long, private months of healing would give Amy Grant's voice a new depth, one that would soon return to the spotlight, transformed by grace and held together by love. When Amy Grant finally stepped back into the public eye, no one expected what they saw. It was December of 2023, nearly a year and a half since the accident. The Ryman Auditorium was glowing with Christmas lights, the same stage where she and Vince had performed their annual holiday shows for years. But this time it felt different. The crowd wasn't there for spectacle or nostalgia. They were there to see if the woman who'd once carried their faith could still sing. The lights dimmed. The band began to play. Then, out of the shadows, Amy walked onto the stage. No dramatic entrance, no rush, just quiet steps, a deep breath and a smile that carried both pain and peace. Her voice wasn't the same as before. It trembled slightly, her phrasing slower, more deliberate. Yet every note seemed to come from someplace deeper, someplace she'd fought hard to return from. Fans wiped tears as she began her first song, "Breath of Heaven." Vince stood just off stage, hands clasped, eyes locked on her. He didn't sing along, didn't move, he just watched, as if afraid that even blinking might break the moment. This wasn't a performance, it was resurrection. Halfway through the set, Amy paused. The audience waited in silence. "I've learned," she said softly, that grace doesn't always come the way we expect. Sometimes it comes when you can't remember your own song. The crowd rose to their feet, not cheering, but crying. The kind of applause that comes from people who've seen their own pain reflected in someone else's courage. That night became one of the most talked about moments in Nashville's modern history. Fans flooded social media with messages, "She's back, she's different, she's stronger," and they were right. The woman who had once been the bright face of Christian pop now carried something weightier, a kind of wisdom born from survival. After that night, Amy slowly began performing again, but always on her own terms. Fewer shows, softer lighting, smaller venues. She didn't chase perfection. She invited peace. Her sets became as much about reflection as music, part concert, part testimony. People didn't just come to hear her sing, they came to watch her be. Vince often joined her, harmonizing quietly, letting her lead. Observers said you could feel his reverence, a man who knew the value of every word she managed to sing. During one duet, "House of Love," she reached for his hand. For a moment, they just stood there, smiling through tears, two voices barely holding together, but somehow creating something whole. It wasn't lost on anyone that Amy's voice, the same one that had filled arenas for decades, now sounded smaller. But in that fragility was something luminous. It reminded people that faith, like healing, isn't loud. It's quiet, trembling, but unbroken. In interviews, Vince spoke little about what they'd endured. When asked how he felt seeing her on stage again, he simply said, "Every time she sings, it's a miracle I get to witness." That single sentence traveled far, quoted in newspapers and across fan pages, because everyone knew he meant it. Amy's story began inspiring others, recovering from trauma, from illness, from loss. Letters poured in, people thanking her for showing what grace looked like in motion. And for Vince, that became the true measure of their comeback. Not applause, not awards, but the lives quietly touched by one woman's fight to keep going. After one concert, when the hall had emptied and the lights dimmed, Amy turned to Vince and said, "I never thought I'd sing again." He smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "You never stopped," he whispered. And in that moment, surrounded by empty seats and fading echoes, they both knew the truth. She hadn't just returned to the stage, she'd returned to herself. These days, Amy Grant no longer measures her life in albums or tours. She measures it in mornings. The simple grace of waking up without pain, walking barefoot through her Nashville garden, and hearing Vince Gill strumming somewhere in the house. The woman who once lived on schedules, deadlines, and stage lights has slowed into something gentler, and in that stillness, she's found peace. Her accident changed more than her memory. It changed her perspective. The pace of recovery forced her to look at life differently, not as a list of goals to achieve, but as moments to survive, moments to cherish. Friends say she laughs more now, even when her speech falters slightly. She jokes about forgetting lyrics, about taking the scenic route through her own thoughts. But behind the humor, there's a deep calm, a sense that she's made peace with the things she can't control. For Vince, that transformation has been its own quiet miracle. He used to define his world by performance and perfection. Now he says love taught him patience, and Amy taught him surrender. The man who once filled arenas now finds his greatest joy in the sound of her voice across the living room. Some evenings they sit together in silence, listening to old records, smiling when a song from decades ago drifts by. "That was our season," she'll say softly, and he'll nod, remembering. When Amy does perform now, it's less about proving she's back, and more about showing that grace endures. Her sets are intimate, her words slower, her gaze softer. Every audience can feel it. She's not the same Amy who once conquered the charts. She's something rarer, an artist reborn through pain, grateful for every fragile breath. When she talks about her accident, she doesn't focus on the fear or the hospital days. She talks about what came after, the stillness, the gratitude, the faith that held. "I don't remember everything," she told a reporter once, smiling gently, "but maybe that's a gift. It lets me fall in love with life again every morning." Those words spread across social media, printed in magazines and fan blogs, because they captured something beyond celebrity. It was a testimony. And through it all, Vince has remained her steady ground. He's no longer the headline beside her name, but the quiet harmony beneath every melody. When fans see them together, his hand at her back, her head tilted toward him, it feels like witnessing what love looks like when all the noise fades away. Their story has become more than music. It's a portrait of endurance, a reminder that faith isn't the absence of struggle. It's the courage to keep singing when the words are gone. For Vince and Amy, that lesson cost nearly everything, yet gave them something they didn't know they'd lost: the beauty of slowing down, of truly listening, of simply being together. On quiet nights when the house is still and the moonlight spills across the hardwood floors, Vince sometimes picks up his guitar and begins to play. Amy will listen, eyes closed, her hand resting on his arm. And though the world may never know what they say in those moments, it's written in the silence between them, the kind of love that survives not because it's perfect, but because it's real. In the end, Amy Grant's story isn't about tragedy or fame. It's about what remains when both are stripped away. A woman who once sang to the world learned how to listen again, to her heartbeat, to her faith, to the man who never stopped believing beside her. And Vince Gill, the husband who once stood in the shadows of her spotlight, found himself in the quiet glow of devotion, where love isn't loud or polished, it's steady, and it stays. Together, they remind us that healing isn't a finish line. It's a long walk home, hand in hand, through the ache and the grace of being alive. The music they make now isn't meant for charts. It's meant for the soul, raw, trembling, and full of light. Because sometimes the truest songs aren't written in studios or on stages. They're written in hospital rooms, in late-night prayers, and in the fragile silence between two people who refuse to give up. For more emotional stories, check out this video.